I got a feeling.
This is the Alex Pierson Show.
It sure is. But in for Alex Pierson is Kevin Vuong. And thank you for coming back with us. It's 1:33 p.m. I am Kevin Vuong, and I'm so thrilled to be with our friends in London, Ontario at 980 CFPL, and of course everyone here at AM 640. Now, before the break, we were talking about a conversation that I think is just meth up. All right? It was insane. I won't take credit for that. One of our listeners texted that in, and I just needed to find a way to work it in because I thought it was so clever. But similarly, I think meth up is this news that the CBC is apparently going to get even more money, or at least that is the intention of the Justin Trudeau government. And to help unpack that and what they are trying to do is Chris Sims, Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Chris, welcome to the Alex Pierson Show.
Thanks so much for having us on.
So I know, Chris, you have been at the forefront of making sure that Canadians know what exactly this government is doing with our hard-earned taxpayer dollars. And it seems like one of the least and worst places to get our return on investment is investing in the CBC. So talk to me about what their plan is.
Yeah, this was kind of mind-blowing. So your listeners probably remember footage of the CBC president and CEO, Catherine Tate, at what's called the Heritage Committee on Parliament Hill. Now, the reason why Tate, the CEO of the state broadcaster, was dragged in front of there and appeared, which was a very rare thing before the last couple of years, I must say, the reason why she was testifying at committee so often is because the committee was supposedly tasked with a report on how to improve the CBC. So things like accountability, viewership, expense, all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That is where we famously saw Tate say, I don't know if we're going to be handing out bonuses. Turns out they did. This past year, they handed out $18 million worth of bonuses. And that was after they announced layoffs in their newsrooms. So it's all the footage from that. And the Taxpayers Federation, we also testified at committee, and we said, all of the opposite things. We said that the CBC should be defunded because it's a huge waste of money. Nearly nobody is watching it. And it's a conflict of interest for journalists to be paid by the government.
Mm-hmm.
All that understood. What was bizarre is that just before the House rose for the Christmas break and the holidays, the majority Trudeau MPs on that Heritage Committee squeaked their little report in to the House of Commons. And what was mind-blowing is that they said the solution to all of this is to give the CBC more money. Yeah.
Insane.
I gotta say, the Taxpayers Federation, we've been pushing to defund the CBC for years, but even the cheerleader group for the CBC, Friends of Canadian Media, even they said that the bonuses were unbecoming.
Yeah.
And yet they still turn around and said, yeah, let's give them, $2 billion a year.
Have they never been in a private sector company? Bonuses are reward for a good job and high performance. And yeah. I would suggest the CBC is not meeting its performance targets. Viewership continues to go down. So what are they rewarding other than and I haven't necessarily been a subscriber to this theory that, hey, this is part of the deep state. CBC always supports, the Trudeau party and all that sort of stuff. But it just feeds it further because they're not performing there, and yet they are being rewarded with even more money.
Yeah, it's a bad look. So, taking off my CTF hat and putting on my political analyst hat, because I've been in the arena for a long time. Probably 25 years, mostly as a journalist. And full disclosure, I even worked at the CBC for like 6 weeks in Ottawa. No problems. They were really nice people. It just wasn't a super great fit. But it was still a pleasant place to work.
Mm-hmm.
The thing here is that the optics are bad, like you just pointed out. A lot of your listeners might remember that the CBC started suing the Conservative Party in the middle of an election campaign.
Yeah.
For using footage from the CBC. Now, I won't get into the wonky weeds, but those of us in broadcasting understand that there's an idea of fair use. If you're using it for news purposes or to inform people, blah, blah, blah. So that understood. That optic was terrible. But even if the CBC were right-wing, number one, it would be wrong for journalists to be paid by the government.
Thank
It is
you.
an obvious conflict of interest. You cannot hold the government to account if you're counting on the government for your paycheck.
Hmm.
Kind of basic. And further, the money here is eye-watering. So as of right now, before this, increase to their funding may or may not go through, as of right now, the CBC is costing taxpayers $1.4 billion with a B this year.
Wow.
To put that into perspective, that could pay the full-time salaries of 7,000 cops and 7,000 paramedics combined. Instead, it's an eye-watering amount of money. And so we're spending all this money. And to your point on, viewership and return on investment, we did a bunch of freedom of information requests. And having been in broadcasting most of my life, I was astonished at some of these low numbers. So we did an FOI on the 6 o'clock news for
Hmm.
TV and CBC in Toronto. So the supper hour newscast that we grew up with.
Yep.
0.7% of
Oh my God.
Torontonians are watching it. I know. It was like that's a rounding error in ratings.
In the private sector, you cut that. Okay, you cut.
That's right. That's right. You don't increase and you don't reward with bonuses.
Oh,
This is what is bizarre. And I got to put a bill on this thing here. So Catherine Tate, this outgoing, meaning she's leaving, the CEO of the CBC is paid around $500,000 a year.
oh my God.
Like $500,000 a year. Her bonus is up to 28%. Her bonus that she's entitled to is more than what the average two-person working family makes. It's mind-blowing.
I'm getting mad sitting here listening to you.
Sorry.
It's because like you said, not only because there are people struggling to make ends meet, but everyone works hard and still pays taxes. And we want those taxes to ultimately go back to help Canadians. And instead, they're rewarding someone who sucks at her job. Okay.
Yep.
You're a president of CBC. You're overseeing the continued decline, and you're being rewarded for decline. You're being rewarded for being bad at your job. And I think it's important to point out that now, as much as we focus on how bad they are, CBC still is able to collect almost $500 million in their own revenue, which should be enough, Chris, don't you think, to be able to still run different aspects, whether it's their radio broadcast and other programs?
That is a great point. And you really hit the nail on the head there because it's pertinent to the report that these Trudeau MPs slipped in just before the Christmas break. So, yes, if you go back to the CBC's own financial reports, they self-generate between $400 million and $500 million per year. That's nothing to sneeze at. I mean, you're working in radio right now. I worked in radio for most of my life. We both know that $500 million could go an awful long way to supporting a radio network with programming that people choose to listen to
Mhm.
and perhaps even pay for if they want to get into like satellite subscriptions and stuff. So that is a lot of money that they're self-generating. Now, to be fair, I want to put a point on this. We don't know how much of that is government advertising revenue. So we would
Okay.
need to look into that. However, just on the books, what we see face value is about between 400 and 500 million with an M.
Mhm.
But get this. So I highlighted that during my testimony at the committee as a good thing of, hey, you guys actually generate your own money, go out on your own ticket, do your thing. But these MPs said, no, 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 let's eliminate that. So let's take away their subscription money. Let's take away their ad revenue money and make it 100% on the backs of the taxpayer, which
That's
is why,
insane.
if they did that, the price tag for the CBC, $2 billion a year.
Wow. But Chris, what I wanted to ask you is, let's look ahead to 2025. At some point, there's going to be a change in government. You and I have spoken in the past about how Pierre Poilievre has been clear about his intention to defund CBC. They still collect $500 million in revenue. I know you pointed out that we're not sure exactly what the breakdown is in terms of how much of that is government paid ads. But I am curious to kind of look ahead to 2025 and get your thoughts on what that CBC that is run on its own self-collected revenues looks like. Is that TV completely gone? Is it still there? Is it radio, their radio programming? What does that look like in 2025?
That's a great question. Before I get into, because I would love to imagine an entire media network with you. Before I get into that, though, I just wanted to point something out that I often hear well-meaning folks say about the CBC, and some not so well-meaning. For example, Catherine Tate, the CBC president, actually said in committee recently that if not for the CBC, there would be no Inuktitut language in Canada.
Hmm.
It's just jaw-dropping. And so people often bring up something like, well, what about Indigenous programming? You know, the CBC is the savior of Indigenous programming.
APTN.
Yeah, they say it all the time. Thank you. They say this all the time. And I just wanted to point out a number here. Okay. The CBC spent just over 6 million with an M on Indigenous services.
That's insulting. The
Dude,
audacity to claim.
This is, yeah,
Wow.
I know.
Sorry, I'm
So
getting
get
upset.
this,
I'm
you're
cutting
going to
you
get
off.
angrier. Just a sec. That is 0.3% of their funding. That is less than half of what they spent on bonuses recently.
Oh my God.
So don't you let folks tell you we need to keep this behemoth of the CBC to protect Indigenous programming. To your point exactly, APTN does an outstanding job. Almost all of it is self-funded. They're right out of Winnipeg, tons of Indigenous languages, lots of investigative journalism. Don't let CBC apologists tell you we need them for this. Okay, so moving from there, let's say they were able to still self-generate $400 million. So keep in mind that can be ad revenue, it could be online funding, they could do telethons. I'm not kidding. They could do subscriptions. So it would be kind of a combination of what we used to see, because I don't know what the case is right now, what we used to see with TVO, TV Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in Ottawa for about 20 years. I personally donated to TVO because I appreciated their programming. So if you
Nice.
have fundraiser drives like that and pledge drives and subscriptions and maybe some advertising, they could have a really healthy bottom line and they could produce a great radio network. As you know, great radio needs a good brain and a phone connection. Really. And so between that and podcasts, they could do an amazing amount of storytelling. Now, as far as TV goes, it would be scaled down. They wouldn't have a humongous at issue panel they're paying hundreds of dollars per hit to each person every night.
Oh, that
They
must be
wouldn't
nice.
have an LCD liquid crystal display desk on their floor. Like, of course, it would be scaled down, I would imagine. But folks who choose to watch CBC's programming and value it, they'd still be able to get it. It just wouldn't be forcing you and me and our neighbors to pay for it.
Mm-hmm. And you know, I point this out almost every time I discuss it, I think with you, Chris, for sure, is, you know, here we are in the radio, in the studio, there's three of us, the host,
Yep.
a producer, a technical producer. And as I understand, there's something like 3 times that number of personnel for the CBC. And I have to ask, what are the other 6 or 7 people doing?
Great question. So this is a bit of inside baseball, but for people who are listening, they're clearly fans of the show, so I can get into inside baseball. So yeah, that's been the general rule of thumb. For those of us who've worked in both private, what we would call regular media, and or the CBC, the difference is astonishing. So when I was in private media, I would usually share a desk with another human being, so the morning producer or the afternoon producer, whoever it is, and there'd be 2 or 3 of us, often including the host, as you're doing right now. Same thing for TV. When I was producing the 5 o'clock live show every day from Parliament Hill, there were 2 of us plus the host. And of course, there were camera people that were helping as well to move the chairs and such and shoot it.
Mm-hmm.
You go over to the CBC, and I witnessed this myself, where we were 3, they are about 14.
14. Oh, so that is 4 or 5 times.
It was wild. Now, this was specifically the 5 o'clock show. So
Okay.
the average might scale down a little bit as you get into the regular, mom and pop news coverage. But yeah, that's just been the standard operating procedure. And this is it. It's not just the frontline journalists because, hey, I know what it's like to get let go or laid off, especially just before Christmas. It's awful. So we're not sitting here wishing this on
Of
people.
course.
We're saying that taxpayers don't need to pay for this. They should be self-funded. And if they did that, that would force them, you know what, to get rid of their massive management. Their huge strangling levels of management at the CBC, and maybe they'll start covering stuff that people want to tune into.
For the record, Chris, when you were speaking, I was looking around the studio here, and there's only 5 seats. You couldn't even fit 14 people in here. It's so, I sit here as someone who grew up, a fan of the CBC and some of their productions, but over the last few years, especially, just seeing how they're not they're not responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. And I think the shift towards them having to earn their own keep is important because it also keeps it keeps you innovative and entrepreneurial, right? If you always know you're going to be able to get more funding, regardless of how you're performing, what motivation is there for them to be innovative, to have great programming, or just frankly be more efficient in their operations?
Exactly. And again, just speaking personally, we're probably close to the same generation. I grew up listening to the CBC. I grew up listening to Peter Zosky and Barbara Frum and watching Knowlton Nash and the whole nine yards. I'm super upset still that Don Cherry's gone. I grew up watching Hockey Night in Canada like the rest of us. The thing is, number one, we have changed drastically in Canada from when the CBC was first launched. The CBC was first launched to do a few things: to give farmers the weather, to let us know the hockey score,
Yes.
and to try to dilute some of the soap opera, literally radio soap opera drama programming coming out of powerhouses in places like New York and Chicago.
Interesting.
We are like worlds different now. Anybody can pick up the weather whenever they want. The hockey score is available basically in the ether, and people have a million different options when it comes to entertainment.
Yeah.
So totally different world. And to your point on funding, on government funded journalism, that is again a direct conflict of interest. And I say this as both a taxpayer representative, because it's a waste of money, and as a journalist. Journalism is a calling. You are supposed to speak truth to power. And if you are being paid by those in power, even if you worked your darndest to try to remain objective, it's the perception of bias that kills trust.
Absolutely.
And I will this will back this up. 61% of Canadians now believe that journalists and reporters are purposely trying to mislead people by saying things they know are false or gross exaggerations. That is a Edelman Trust survey that they just did.
Wow.
It's astonishing.
Chris, thank you for joining us on the Alex Pierson Show.
Thank you so much. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.